why don't we jump right into our next session. So we've had much discussion today about contracting for disruptive technologies. But many of you in the room, probably all of you, have existing sourcing agreements in place, many of which involve IT infrastructure. So we want to spend the next session talking about how do we integrate disruptive technologies into our existing sourcing arrangements. There was a time when people didn't have to look at their existing agreements until the next time they came up for renewal. That's not this time. Things are changing so fast. Technologies are emerging, digital strategies are changing, business requirements are changing. We have to literally be looking at our sourcing agreements all the time and looking for what do we need to do, what do we need to change to make it work. So I want to take a second and talk, well, by the way, that's Linda and me. I want to talk about defining the opportunity. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the emergence of new technologies, business solutions, and approaches. Think cloud, everything as a service, robotics and autonomics that we just talked about. Think this is different ways to do the same thing we're doing now, right? Cloud is a different technology. It provides a different way to deliver basic IT infrastructure services, but it doesn't in and of itself do anything different. So we're going to talk about that possibility. We also have the emergence of new digital strategies, people focusing on mobility and data analytics and other ways in which the emerging technologies can advance their business. So here we're talking about new things being done, but they're all IT enabled, so they all in different ways, impact your existing IT relationships. We also have, emerging suppliers. A few years ago, while we do a large volume of deals every year, we were doing deals with the same 8 to 10 providers over and over again. First-tier U.S. providers, some of the Indian heritage providers, but a small group. We did a count last year, and in the preceding 2 years, we had done deals with more than 50 providers, many of which didn't even exist a few years earlier. And these aren't just tiny firms. Some of them are. Some of the SaaS providers are quite small. But we have the emergence now of Amazon and Microsoft as a cloud provider and Rackspace and Salesforce. They're huge companies in their own right. So the question here it's not necessarily whether we're doing something new and different or more of the same. It's having different providers that are available to perform that function. And in the context of your existing agreements, they can be performing the function either as a separate contractor performing scope previously done by your existing provider, or as a subcontractor to your existing provider, or a managed third party. The last one is changes driven by technology on what do we buy. And we've talked about the income, or the focus on outcome and purchasing outcomes rather than, so if you think of it, rather than buying a certain number of FTEs or devices or capabilities or MIPS in the old days to perform functions. Instead, buying the outcome which can be created by that technology. There's a quote from a Harvard marketing professor that I love where he said, "Nobody wants to buy quarter-inch drill bits. Everyone wants to buy quarter-inch holes." And if you think about it, I mean, why are we buying servers and mainframe computers? That's only a means to an end. Why can't we buy the end? So there are the opportunities. So what we're going to talk about today are what are some of the strategic and tactical considerations that you want to think about as you're looking at this. So I'm going to focus for a minute on process, and we'll talk generally about that. Linda's going to talk then about what are the impediments, what are the things that get in the way of doing this, and then we're going to take a case study that and that's actually drawn from a number of different transactions we've worked on, but talk in concrete terms about some of the issues that come up. So process, timing. The answer is there's never a bad time. This is not an issue of, again, that we can wait till 2 years before expiration. Even with shorter term contracts, this is something that's always going to be driven by the needs of the business. The requirements of the business are to go better, faster, cheaper, introduce new technologies, implement a new digital strategy. That's going to be what drives your timing. So what's the role of the existing provider? And there's no right answer to that, and it really does depend on your provider and the relationship you have. In some cases, the provider can have an enormously positive role in the process in terms of being a resource, in terms of what's possible and not possible, and what can you do and what does it take to get there. They can also be a huge impediment. Many providers are resistant to change. They already have cut their deal. They're making money, and the last thing they want to do is do something which is going to reduce your cost or complicate their life. So it's going to depend on your relationship with the particular provider. It's going to depend on whether they have their own capabilities to deliver the things that you're looking to add. Obviously, if they have that capability, and many of them do, they can be a great resource, a self-promoting resource perhaps, but a great resource. On the other hand, if they don't have that capability, they're certainly going to be looking to resist your moving in that direction. It's also going to depend on their willingness to embrace change. And, that, again, it's often scary for them to do that. And their willingness to put a competitive proposition on the table without having competition in the room. And some providers are good at that and some just aren't. Let's see. I'm sorry, I went too far. Cost-benefit analysis. Often this is not as simple as it was when you did your original deal. It's not driven by just reducing the cost of performing the same function. That was complicated enough, but at least you could do your business case and your base case and what it was going to cost you to do this and what would it cost the provider. Often now we're talking about benefits that are not easily quantifiable: speed to market, customer loyalty, pleasing the customer, reducing your cost of maintaining your inventory, building customer satisfaction, increasing customer renewal rates. Often it is actually the price may be going up in order to achieve a business goal that is important and that will either reduce external spend in other areas or drive greater revenue. So the other, I think, critical thing in the process is the change management considerations. Driving change in an organization is never easy, and it can be particularly difficult when you are moving into areas that are really uncomfortable for people, that they don't have a great deal of knowledge or experience with. And I think that you really have to be honest with yourself about your organization and their willingness to embrace change, their willingness to relinquish control, because many of the things that we're talking about involve accepting the fact that you're going to have less control. In a public cloud deal, you are not going to have the same control rights that you have in a traditional data center IT infrastructure deal. It just isn't possible. And so are you really willing to accept that? Are you willing to move to a more vanilla one-to-many solution? Many larger companies have very complicated, expensive to maintain, highly customized solutions. Are you willing to move to one that doesn't have that and where it may provide a great set of functions and capabilities, but in a different way than what you're getting right now and without all of the customizations and bells and whistles? Are you really willing to maintain a certain level of currency that will be dictated by the provider? We've done deals where clients said, I'm all set to embrace this. I'm ready to go, we've done the deal, and then the provider has come back and said, by the way, as we've talked about, we're now moving to the next version of this software, and within a year you're going to have to move there, and the client says, I'm not moving there. I wasn't planning on going there for 2 years. And it's back, no, remember, we're going to go within the next year, and in order to get the full functionality, you're going to have to move, and the deal falls apart because, in truth, they weren't ready to do that, and they always thought that they would have greater control. So being honest with yourself about your organization's willingness to embrace these things. And finally, utilizing the process to create and maintain negotiating leverage. In our experience, just sort of starting a process without a deadline and a sense of urgency it seems to be a recipe for disaster. Things get bogged down, they never really move forward, the teams don't really commit on either side. So I think it's really important to create a sense of urgency, to create deadlines, even if they're artificial deadlines that people buy into and that drive the process. I think it's really important to create the specter of competition. The existing provider has to understand that you have options and you're considering options, and that while you may be willing to consider an offer from them, if it's delivered as compelling and delivered within a reasonable period of time, that you do have options and know it and are prepared to follow through. So with that, let me turn it to Linda to talk about impediments.
Thanks, Dan. So now you've gone and you've defined the opportunity, you've heard about exciting new technologies, and you're ready to go ahead and start implementing into your environment. You've seen that there's maybe some cost benefits and or other types of benefits from these new technologies, so you're ready to move forward. So what's stopping you? There's also some impediments you need to think about. You need to think about what they are, and you need to think about how you're going to overcome them as you start moving towards more digital technology in your solutions. The first is transition charges. So let's say, for example, you're taking your applications from a traditional data center and you want to move it to a cloud infrastructure. And say perhaps you want to take your storage solution and move to a cloud storage solution. There's going to be some transition work associated with that. There's going to be solutioning the new digital putting together the new digital solution. There's going to be architecting it. There's going to need to be a detailed plan. You'll need to think through the migration of your applications from the data center environment to the cloud environment. And perhaps you're going to need the roadmap, and then you're going to have to implement all that. Then further, perhaps you need new tools for monitoring the new digital environment. Maybe you also need a new disaster recovery plan once you get to the new cloud environment. So all this is going to take some time and some costs that you have to consider as part of your planning for your move to the digital solution. And as Paul mentioned in his prior conversation, if it's really certain types of new digital technologies that you're implementing, there might be also some transformation and transformation planning that needs to be done as part of all of this. The next, termination charges. I think you've also heard earlier from others that there may be some termination costs associated with moving to a new solution. You're at a little bit of an advantage if you're working from your existing contract because you're not actually going to be terminating it in its entirety, but you may be terminated in part, which may trigger termination charges, and or you may be working down certain resource units in such a way that you might hit the minimum commitments in your contract, which may either require you to continue to pay minimum charges and or may also trigger some termination charges. So that's an additional cost and contract term that you need to work through. So hopefully, if it's your existing provider and you're going to be providing additional digital work through that provider, you're going to have some leverage around negotiating those kinds of charges. But some of those types of termination charges, for example, stranded costs, which I'm going to talk about further in a second, your provider may not be willing to just absorb those or forego those if they're actually going to have real costs associated with stranded equipment and the like. I don't think I've kept up with my slides. Thank you. So stranded costs. What do we have? Let's say you have equipment. Let's say you have your own data center and you've bought your data center equipment, but now you're going to move to the digital solution. So you may have stranded equipment that you've invested in that you're no longer going to be able to use. And most likely you've purchase equipment and you refresh equipment on specific refresh schedules, and the timing for your transition to your digital cloud solution may not coincide with the timing of the end of life of your equipment. So you might think that you're going to have some stranded costs associated with that. Similarly, if it's the provider that provided the equipment and now you're moving off their equipment, they're going to have some stranded costs, and they're going to look to you to reimburse some of those costs through termination charges and the like. In a typical outsourcing transaction, one of the options that you have is, in lieu of paying termination charges for stranded costs, you can purchase the equipment or the assets yourself. Well, obviously that's not an option in this environment because you're actually going to a digital solution, and for you to acquire that equipment is no better than paying the termination costs. So there's real costs associated with it that you need to think through. There's similarly, there could be third-party maintenance costs or other contracts that you've entered into, and that to terminate those early, because they're not necessary once you move to the digital environment, may carry termination costs. So that's another cost that could be associated with moving from your traditional outsourcing solution to your digital solution. Another thing, let's say you have your own data center and you've leased space for it and it's your equipment in there. Well, what happens to that leased space? If you're going to be moving to a digital solution, you're going to put your data on a cloud infrastructure. What are you going to do with this leased space that you have? Can you utilize it for other purposes? Is there a way to get your provider to help you with that, to assume those lease obligations and perhaps use it in other means for other customers? So yet another kind of piece of the puzzle you need to think through as you change your solution. As Dan mentioned, another impediment that you may face is the mindset of the existing organization. You need to be honest in assessing your organization's willingness to change. Your technology team and others in your organization are used to receiving services in a certain manner, and once you change the processes on them, there may be some burden associated and some resistance to that. So you need to think through, what's my plan for telling my organization about this transition, and how do I get them to accept it and embrace it and all the benefits that it can provide for us. Okay, I think I'm going to turn to Dan now to sort of walk us through our example.
So the most common place that we've seen this come up is in companies that have an existing IT infrastructure arrangement in place, and where they have layered onto that a cloud capability, either going in for part of it, all of it, but over a period of time adding cloud as a piece of it. How many of you have in place existing IT outsourcing arrangements now, infrastructure? How many of you would have added cloud to that at some point? So I think that's a place where we are seeing this come up a lot. So this case study will make a lot of sense to you, because that's what we're going to focus on, is that occurring. This is not any single client. This is a composite of things that we've run across in different transactions. So I think the first thing we need to think through is, what's the role for the existing managed service provider? Managed service providers come in multiple flavors here. There are some who have their own cloud capabilities. They can deliver a cloud solution. IBM went out and bought Supplier, for example, so that they could have their own cloud provider. Others are willing to incorporate the cloud provider as a subcontractor and to take responsibility for what they do. Many, however, are not willing to do that and are really looking to deal with it as a managed third party, with you holding the contract and with you having a separate contract with the cloud provider, not covered by the existing contract. So what's the role of the existing provider? You obviously could go out and contract directly with the cloud provider. You don't need to go. You could take the work away from the existing provider and go directly, have your own separate contract, manage it yourself, deal with the gaps that are in place between what you've been promised by the cloud provider and what you had under the existing agreement. But let's assume for the moment that you see value in the role that the managed service provider can play, and that you see value in, as I think it was referred to in Brad and Joe's presentation, with the managed service provider playing the role of the service integrator. Okay, so what do we have in place? Well, if you have a separate contract with the cloud provider, and as you know, the separate contract with the cloud provider will look very different from the contract you have in place with your managed service provider. It's likely to have very different performance standards and service levels. It's likely to have a very different approach to governance and control. So, and there will be gaps between what you had previously been promised and what you are receiving, and it will fall to the customer to manage those gaps. So there are challenges in having that direct contract. Some of those challenges continue even if you have the managed service provider, because the managed service provider will view their role as managing to the terms that you have in place with the cloud provider. If there are different service levels, those are the service levels they will look to manage to. If there are differences in how the services are being delivered and there are gaps, or if there are governance issues, you may well have them coming to you and saying, the managed service provider is not doing what they're supposed to do, and you, customer, because you have that contract with them, should go and bring them into line. If instead you go the direction of either a provider that has its own cloud capabilities or one that's willing to take on the cloud provider as a subcontractor, there are some significant advantages. One is you get to leverage your existing contractual arrangement. Instead of starting from scratch with the cloud provider's form, you can actually build from your existing agreement. There are obviously deviations, and Linda's going to talk about that. There are things in your traditional IT infrastructure contract that the cloud provider cannot agree to and that the managed service provider can't agree to in the context of the cloud. And we'll talk about that. But in terms of the robustness of the contractual provisions that you're likely to get, the ability to have a single contract with defined deviations, and the ability to get to contracts more quickly. I think that there are clearly advantages there. There are clearly advantages to having, the managed service provider have overall responsibility for making sure that the cloud provider delivers what they're supposed to deliver, responsibility for owning the gaps. There are often gaps between what the managed service provider can promise and what they're getting from the cloud provider, and they're able to accept responsibility for managing those gaps. A streamlined governance process. As people often say, one throat to choke. I know that I've got one provider. I'm not stuck refereeing between whether the problem was on the managed service provider's side or the cloud provider's side. Having the provider literally manage and fill the gaps, and of course the last is minimizing both transition and termination charges. Often, the cloud or the managed service provider is able in that situation to help you reduce those costs. What are the disadvantages? There are some. The disadvantages are, in many cases, the soft layer and other cloud options offered by managed service providers are suboptimal. They're simply not as good as AWS or Microsoft. If you look at the Gartner charts, they're not in the same quadrant. And if that's important to your company to have, the best cloud provider, the one offering the greatest capabilities, that's something to be sure you look at. The other is that often the managed service provider is going to expect to put a markup on the subcontract, on the charges, the cloud charges of the subcontractor. It's important to have transparency into that so you understand what is the cost that and is it worth it given the advantages you're receiving. Turn it back to Linda.
So as Dan mentioned, you want to leverage your existing contract. You heard Joe and Brad talk about the fact that the terms and conditions that you get in a typical cloud contract are often very different from what you're going to get in a traditional outsourcing transaction. But here you have the advantage. You have an existing contract in place with your provider, and you're going to be adding cloud to it. And in this example, we're going to talk about either a service provider that also has a cloud solution that's bringing in, or a service provider who may bring in AWS or another digital provider to be a subcontractor under it, so you still have the one contract with your traditional outsourced provider. So the first thing is you're going to, because there's differences in terms between the traditional outsourcing contract and typical cloud offerings, your provider is going to come to you and say, we may need some deviations to what we have in our standard contract terms to account for this cloud provider. And so because you're using your existing contract, the onus is really on your provider to come to you and say, yes, we need a deviation. Similarly, you may say, okay, I'll grant that deviation, but there's certain conditions that I have to impose on that in order to be able to give you the deviation. And when you go through all this, a very important point is when your traditional provider comes to you and says, I need to make a deviation because now we have a cloud solution, you want to make sure that deviation applies only to the cloud portion of the solution. This shouldn't be the opportunity for your provider to come in and renegotiate your entire contract in terms that apply to the same services that they were providing before you renegotiated. So that's a very key term in how you approach these negotiations. Do I have the next slide? So what are some of the differences, for example? Joe and Brad touched on them a little, but I'm going to go through a few more examples just to show how they'll work in the context of building this into your existing contract. Control rights. So typically in your traditional outsourcing agreement, you have specified service locations. The services need to be provided from the service location specified in the supplement, or we otherwise have to, the customer, have to approve it. A cloud provider, that's really sort of inconsistent with the whole notion of a cloud provider that you have to approve the service location. The whole idea is that the location can move around. So that may be a deviation that you have to agree to as part of the renegotiation. But you don't want to just say, okay, move the services wherever you want. You want to make sure that to the extent that there's customer data that's going to be on that cloud, that you continue to have the same requirements apply to the customer data. So in other words, you may, with a lot of sophisticated providers, they may provide jurisdictional clouds. I have a US-based cloud. And so if you have contractual or regulatory reasons why you need your data in the U.S., you may say, okay, provider, you can move the cloud infrastructure within the U.S. without my approval, but the data can't go outside of the U.S. So that's a sort of contingency that you want to have associated with the deviation that you're giving for your cloud provider. So that's one example. Approval rights. So typically in your contracts, you have the right to approve key personnel, you have the right to approve subcontractors, you have the right to require removal of these people if you're not satisfied with them. That's not a term that cloud providers typically go along with. In the first instance, there may not even be any key supplier personnel because the idea of the cloud solution is they're providing this platform and you're going to have the managed existing provider kind of be this face-to-face with you for the services. So you're probably not going to have the right to approve employees. Subcontractors, again, cloud providers are very resistant to say, yes, you can come in and you can approve my subcontractors. Rarely will they agree to that. But what you don't want to do is go to your traditional contract and say, okay, we'll take out the provisions that relate to subcontracting. What you want to do is look at it carefully and say, okay, maybe I don't have the right to approve the subcontractor, but all the terms and conditions that require my provider to flow through terms to subcontractors, those need to continue to apply. And all the terms in my subcontract or my existing contract that say you, the provider, continue to be responsible for the acts of the subcontractor, that has to all continue to apply too. So when you create the deviations, you need to be specific about what the deviation is. Similarly, audit rights. In your contract, you probably have the right to audit the facilities of your provider. Very rarely, if ever, will a cloud provider allow you to come in and audit their facilities. So perhaps that's a deviation you agree to in your contract, but there has to be some contingencies around it. You may say, okay, we can't come in and audit your facility, but I know you do a SOC 2 Type 2 report, and most cloud providers will allow you to receive a copy of the results of that audit, of that controls audit. And so you want to make sure as part of granting this deviation that that's a requirement that you get copies of those reports. That's just sort of an example of one of the contingencies. Post-termination rights. Typically, the way you work in your traditional outsourcing agreements is that you have post-termination rights unless the supplier calls out in the schedule that you're not going to have them. Rarely does a cloud provider say, sure, have post-termination rights to make technology. You know, as Brad described it, it's a subscription service, and so you're not going to have rights lingering after the fact. One point I would like to make on post-termination is you might want to agree with your provider that, hey, if we want to terminate you, our provider, we want to have the right to continue to use the cloud provider to provide the cloud infrastructure when we move to another provider or when we bring services in-house. So that's a post-termination right you might want to negotiate with your provider in your contract. Okay, next one. So seek to avoid and minimize stranded costs. As we talked about earlier, that a lot of times in your outsourcing contract, as you move to the cloud or other digital solution, you're going to have stranded equipment or you may have stranded leases or the like. So you want to do what you can to minimize those. One way you may be able to do it is that if you move to the cloud, but maybe you have a migration plan where you move certain applications or services over a period of time onto the cloud. And you may be able to align some of that movement with your end of life of your equipment. So it will help to mitigate some of those costs. Similarly with your third-party contracts, as they start to expire, you may think, oh, well, there's a termination cost, but if I move this set of applications in 6 months rather than right now, maybe I reduce that termination cost. So you kind of think through your migration plan in ways that it can help you to mitigate some of those costs. Repurpose the assets. So if you've got equipment that you're using, but you have other uses you can make of it, great, or even better, if you can get your provider to take that on and find other purposes for those assets. They may have more options than you have because they have other customers who they can use that equipment for. So I think you want to think through all these ways to mitigate those stranded costs. Next. So we thought about how you incorporate the terms of your cloud solution into your master agreement. Now you've got to focus on how you're going to incorporate the terms into your supplements. So notably, you've got, statements of work, service levels, pricing. You have to think through all those things and how you're going to incorporate that into your traditional outsourcing contracts. When you're thinking about the statement of work and you're thinking about the services that you're going to receive, in many ways they may not be all that different once you move to the cloud environment. I'm sure the platform on which the services are provided are different, but what you receive may not actually be all that different. Or maybe they're not different at the core, but maybe there's some additional capabilities. So you do want to look through your statement of work closely, but understand that some of the things that may change may be subtle. A lot of what you have may continue to apply. Service levels, I think, are pretty tricky. Dan mentioned them before. Service levels offered by providers can be different. But what you really don't want is the finger pointing that Dan mentioned. You don't want to have a service level miss and have the cloud provider say, hey, that was the managed services provider's fault, or vice versa. And in Dan's words, you want to have one throat to choke. In addition to the service levels themselves, you want the methodology to be seamless. And you want the credits to be seamless. A lot of times cloud providers will say, you know, credits are your sole and exclusive remedy. Well, that's never the case in a traditional outsourcing contract. And so you want to look to your provider and your existing provider and say, hey, here's an area where you have to cover the gap. Similarly, exceptions. A lot of times cloud providers will say, we're not responsible for misses if it's a result of the act or omissions of the customer. Well, you spend a lot of time negotiating the excused provision of your contract where there's only excuse if it's a expressly stated obligation of the customer and the provider has tried to perform nonetheless, and all sorts of other hoops. If you were to allow an excuse to a service level miss for the acts or omissions of a customer, you really undercut that negotiation, so you don't want to do that. So this is really a strong area. You want to look to your existing provider and say, you know, you have to fill the gaps for me. So I'll turn it to Dan to talk about pricing.
Thanks, Linda. So there are some interesting pricing issues that come up if you're trying to put together an existing managed services deal and a cloud deal. One of them is, I think, the desire to have transparency. One of the best things about the cloud is the ability to buy, you know, a long laundry list of things and to turn them on and turn them off and to have lots of choices. This isn't a situation in which you have to pick a certain size of device and you buy it and it's yours and will be used in your account for the next 3 to 5 years. This is an opportunity to have lots of choices and remake them. And so one of the things you want to do is give yourself the ability to have those same choices. And I think to give maximum transparency, being able to go right to the cloud provider's price list and to be able to pick things right off that price list and to have a negotiated discount from that pricing and have it available to you and on the same basis that it's available to everyone else. And as often has happened, if that price goes down over time, you get the benefit of the price having gone down over time. Now, you might say, well, how did the managed service provider get paid? So what we like to see is having truly a base charge with ARCs and ROOCs for the managed service provider. So they have their price for the piece that they're providing and the ability to ramp it up or down depending on the volumes, but with full transparency as to what they're being paid for performing the function they're performing and you know, being able to evaluate that versus the value that they're delivering. So I think that's one area that is a challenge. The other area that's a challenge is, you know, our traditional IT infrastructure outsourcing is based on a base charge and ARCs and ROOCs. And if you rook down the base charge to 0, it still leaves a significant amount of money, which represents really the fixed charges that went into the delivery of those services. So as you move from the traditional outsourced environment to the cloud, you have to come up with a way to make sure that you are able to ratchet down the price so that you don't end up paying for a significant infrastructure that's built into the fixed component of the base charge, and that for an infrastructure that you no longer need or that can be substantially downsized. And by the same token, as you're ramping up in the cloud environment, there's going to be a fixed component of that as well. So as you start with small numbers and move up, what you don't want to have is that fixed component built into every ARC charge, because at some point in time you will be dramatically overpaying for the infrastructure required or the fixed costs required from the cloud side. So this is tricky and really takes some thought to make sure that over time you are able to not only shed the unused fixed component of your base charges on the traditional side, but also have a way to arc up on the cloud side. Why don't we stop there? We have 5 minutes. If anyone has questions, I know that many of you have dealt with this very situation in adding cloud to your existing agreement. It'd be interesting to hear more about things that you wrestled with in doing that, if you're willing to share.
Have you seen a circumstance where we contract with a third party and we also contract with the cloud providers, and then we get the third party to use the contracts in the terms that we've already negotiated on a standalone and require them to integrate that into the relationship?
Yeah, so that's one of the options that we talked about, where you have a separate contract. You ask the managed service provider to be the integrator and to manage that. And that's certainly a doable option. It may even be the most common option. I think that it does have some challenges because there are inevitably gaps between what you've been promised by the traditional provider in the traditional environment versus the commitments that you're receiving. And so there are gaps that you have to bear the risk of. There is since it's your contract, at the end of the day, the integrator will do what they can to manage it effectively, but if there are issues that come up, at the end of the day, they will turn to you. And when it comes to what went wrong, it can quickly get into finger pointing over who was actually responsible and what needs to be done to fix it. So it's not an uncommon approach. I think that, the challenge for managed service providers who don't want to move to either having their own capability or their own, or using a subcontractor model, is going to be able to really demonstrate value by managing those gaps more effectively, by limiting the amount of finger pointing, and by aligning the contracts and service levels and the performance standards more carefully. Yes?
We've had an interesting challenge trying to get service providers to just put a description of services for the cloud type services into the contract that's anything like the description of services for all the traditional outsourcing. And I was a little surprised they didn't even really, even when prompted to provide paper, they didn't seem to have, they would refer to their website and then they didn't even really know when it came down to putting it together. It was an interesting exercise forcing them to actually have to describe what the service was, and it was difficult for our side and theirs.
I think you're absolutely right. I will tell you that having just recently, in the last few months, done this twice, one in a subcontractor situation and one with a managed service provider that's also a cloud provider. In that situation, the statements of work, as Linda said, looked remarkably similar. There were very few changes because at the end of the day, they're delivering the very same services, just using an entirely different platform. And so, they started off saying it'll look nothing alike. And when we went through page by page, it was like, oh yeah, I'm still going to do that. Yes, I'm going to do that. Yeah, I'll do that too. So it's one of the interesting differences between the separate contract and the other two options.
Because it's true, a cloud provider, if it's just you and them negotiating directly, you're not going to get a fulsome statement of work. I've yet to see it.
Anything else? Well, thank you very much. I've been given the task to hold the applause till after the announcement. I've been given the task of letting people on the webinar know that this is the end of the program for that portion of the program that's on the webinar. For those who are on the webinar, we hope you found the program informative and useful, and we'll be